And there's just no end to what he does. And so when I say that I think he's one of America's greatest public servants, that is exactly what I mean. Welcome, please, the one and only, the great, the Honorable Michael Dukakis.
I don't know what consecutive, how many consecutive years we've been spending doing this, but it started way, way back when I had been appointed to the Amtrak board by President Clinton and was running around California talking about what else, the importance of a high-speed rail system for California. That was years ago. And I got this call from this fellow Mitrovich who said, how would you like to come down to the San Diego City Club and talk about high-speed rail? And we'll put you up and bring Kitty and we'll make it a weekend. I said, well, sounds interesting. So I did that, and the venue for our event was the front lawn of Larry Lucchino's modest cottage in La Jolla, overlooking the Pacific on a day like today. And we had a wonderful time, and people seemed to be interested in a first-class national rail passenger system for the United States of America, something in my judgment we desperately need here and elsewhere. And apparently, Larry and I had a conversation about Fenway Park in Boston. Some of you may have heard this story. Because everybody in the establishment in Boston, including my successor, Bill Weld, allegedly a conservative Republican, were all hot about a plan to tear down Fenway Park, demolish it, and build a kind of phony version of the real thing at a cost of $850 million, $300 million of which was going to come from the taxpayer. Now, I'm supposed to be a liberal Democrat, but I think one of the best things about my state is that and I'm a fan. I mean, those of you who are from Boston know that when we're born there, we're infected with two diseases, politics and the Red Sox. And I love Fenway, and in point of fact, Kitty and I live literally a 20-minute walk from Fenway Park. I mean, we can hear the organ on a warm summer's evening from our backyard. And apparently I had a discussion with Larry, which I have no memory of, about Fenway and plans to tear it down. And this is long before there was any possibility that Larry Lucchino would become the CEO of the Red Sox. And when it was announced that we had new owners taking over the Red Sox and this guy Lucchino was going to be the CEO, I called George and said, how do I get a hold of Larry? I want to say hi and congratulate him and welcome him. And he gave me his cell phone, and I called him. Hi, terrific. Is there anything I can do to be helpful? I was particularly interested in where to live and a school that had a good, and a town that had a good school system. And I said, well, you want to live in Brookline, which, for those of you who know anything about the Boston area, is the town that Kitty and I grew up in, and is literally the first suburb west of Boston, and practically a part of Boston. I mean, you can get on the streetcar and be in Boston in 15 minutes. And I said, and you'll be 5 minutes from Fenway. And in point of fact, he and Stacy decided to live in Brookline, and that's where they are. And Tito Francona lived in Brookline. John Henry spent I don't know how many millions of dollars to tear down an existing house to build another house, cost many more millions of dollars, but he's in Brookline. So we got this Red Sox contingent. And I said to him in that conversation, I said, and by the way, Larry, I said, I hope, it's great to have you. I hope you'll take a good look at Fenway, at this teardown thing, because I think it's terrible. He said, don't you remember what you said to me when you spoke to the City Club on my front lawn about Fenway? I said, I have no recollection. He said, you said that anybody who was for tearing down Fenway Park should be criminally indicted. Well, I guess I did if he said it. Anyway, to his and his partners and associates' great credit, they stopped, they looked. He brought his wonderful architect up from, Janet Marie Smith, up from Baltimore, where she had done Camden Yard for him. She took one look at the place and said, we're not tearing this place down, we're going to restore it. And we'd been told it couldn't be restored and all that nonsense. And today, folks, for any of you who had an opportunity to come to Boston and visit Fenway, I mean, it's a jewel and they've had, I don't know, how many, George, 770 consecutive sellouts. Even though they didn't perform particularly well this last year or two. And we're all a little concerned about what's going on, what'll be happening this coming year. So that's just a little brief. That was my introduction to the great Mitrovic and the San Diego City Club. And thanks to George and all of you, we've been coming ever since and delivering what George now calls my annual State of the Union address, the San Diego City Club. Thanks to those of you who are nice enough to support me. Sorry I lost. I apologize to all of you. If I'd beaten Bush 1, you'd have never heard of Bush 2. We wouldn't be in this mess, so blame me for, all this stuff. But I thought what I might do today, and I'll try to keep this reasonably brief so we can open this up, because that's the most fun, is to just give you my take, for whatever it's worth, on where we are these days in the United States of America, where we're headed, and at least some observations on what at least I think we ought to be doing, not only to get out of this mess that we got ourselves into, but to build what I think can and should be a very, very strong and promising future for ourselves and our kids and our grandkids. And because I've had the opportunity for the past 20 years, both on the East Coast and the West Coast, to teach some wonderful young people, really wonderful young people who want to do public service, folks, I'm very optimistic about the future. But we got to create an environment in which these kids can thrive and do good things, and obviously I'm concerned. And just for starters, I want to take you back to the year 2000, 12 years ago. Wow, time flies. A little more than 12 years ago. When Bill Clinton was ending up his tenure as president. Now, it wasn't just Clinton. In fact, there were some Republicans in Congress who worked with Clinton to create what was an extremely successful 8 years, especially the last 4. Even though Clinton didn't control the Congress and had Newt Gingrich and the Gingrich Congress and all that kind of stuff to deal with, who tried to shut down the government and all that. As a matter of fact, I'll never forget in 1995, Kitty and I found ourselves in Washington and went in to see the president. It was an old pal. He was the guy that nominated me, for those of you who remember, in Atlanta. By the way, in a nominating speech which was criticized because it was too long. In fact, it was 15 minutes shorter than the one he gave for Obama. But the one he gave for Obama was a lot better than the one he gave for me. And it really wasn't his fault. We kind of approved the thing. It was just too long. And the audience began getting impatient, as some of you recall, at that Atlanta convention where I was nominated. And in point of fact, Clinton, when he announced for the presidency in 1992, went on Johnny Carson. And the first question Carson asked him was, well, why are you running? And Clinton said, because I want to finish my speech for Dukakis. Anyway, we were in his office, in the Oval Office, about half an hour, visiting with him in 95. And it was right, I don't know how many of you remember this, but it was right in the middle of a very intensive 3 weeks where he, Dole, and Gingrich were meeting and had 10 meetings in 3 weeks, trying to resolve this budget mess and this crisis, and they were going to shut the government down. You remember all this kind of stuff. And I said, how's it going? He said, well, I've worked with these guys, but I've met with them now. Pretty serious stuff, 10 times in the past 3 weeks. He looked up at me with a grin. He said, Mike, they're just different from us. So polarization did not. And I said, I don't know whether Melissa's here. Where is she? Anyone? We were talking a little bit about this, and I said, people talk about polarization. Said, have you ever seen it this bad, Dukakis? And I say, well, go see the Lincoln movie. You want to see polarization. Or let me tell you about the McCarthy era. Well, let me tell you about Vietnam, for those of you too young to remember the Vietnam War. We've gone through this before, folks, and somehow we've been able to come out of it. Anyway, let me give you my own take, for whatever it's worth, on the State of the Union. I thought, and I'm not saying this in a partisan sense, but I thought the 8 Bush years were the most fiscally irresponsible years, certainly in my lifetime, maybe in the history of the country. And I'm supposed to be a liberal Democrat. Now, Kitty will tell you I'm the cheapest guy in America. I think that's a little extreme. But if you're the son of Greek immigrants, you will be frugal, let me tell you. I mean, you learn that from an early age. What was so sad, I think, and by the way, Democrats contributed to this during that 8 years in a variety of ways, was that when Clinton left office, yes, there was a housing bubble and we weren't regulating financial institutions as effectively as we should. And as a matter of fact, Clinton himself said the worst mistake he made was to sign that bill, in effect permitting Wall Street to get into the banking business. But this country was in pretty good shape, folks. 4% unemployment, 23 million new jobs. And the first back-to-back budget surpluses in 50 years. In fact, the budget surplus in Clinton's last year was $250 billion. Now, of course, the big question at the time was, what do you do about this? And more conservative members of Congress and their allies kept saying, as some of you will recall, look, it's not the government's money, it's your money, demand it back. You should get a tax cut. Clinton said, look, we can cut taxes, but we've got a couple of challenges out there that we ought to be taking seriously. One of them is the national debt, which by that time had reached the horrendous level of $5 trillion, 5 times what it was when Reagan took over. Now it's 16 trillion. And we've got to do something about that. And in point of fact, he and the Congress had actually cut the national debt by $600 billion in that previous 2 years, because if you just balance your budget, you're going to cut the national debt because you're not borrowing any longer, and you got to pay off some of those bonds. So he said, yeah, we can cut taxes, but we've got an opportunity now to reduce and eliminate the national debt in 10 to 12 years. And I'm proposing a plan to do that. This was all in 2000. Alan Greenspan got very upset. He said, well, if you eliminate the national debt, how can the Federal Reserve function without some national debt? Clinton said, well, we'll leave $500 billion, Alan, for you, so you can, kind of play around the Federal Reserve. But he was very serious about this, laid it out in great detail. And then he said, and we're facing, not immediately, but we're facing a fiscal challenge when it comes to Social Security. We know all about the boomers and this kind of thing. So I'm recommending that as we reduce the national debt, we take the interest that will be saved, put it in the now famous lockbox, remember? And use it to fund Social Security. What do you think of that? The American people, by 2 to 1 in the national poll, said, we're for the president's plan, forget about the tax cut, do what the president's proposing. And by the way, folks, this is a very conservative approach to the nation's fiscal problems. Don't you agree? We've just now gotten into surplus land for the first time in half a century. Let's not blow it. And let's think about the fiscal challenges we're going to be facing in the next 5, 10, 20 years and prepare now and use that surplus. And by the way, I don't remember at that time a lot of people complaining about the level of taxation in this country. As a matter of fact, Clinton had and the Congress had cut taxes 2 or 3 times. And it had very strong public support. Well, 2000 elections, we got a new president, and the rest, as they say, is history. 2 wars, 5 tax cuts, and we got a mess on our hands. And the same folks that created this mess are now bleeding because of the deficit, and what are we going to do about it? So, as the Greeks say, pathima, mathema, things happen, we're supposed to learn from them. I hope this time we'll learn some of these lessons, and those of you, some young people that are taking history, I talked to a few of you, one of the things you want to do is study history, kids. Study it carefully, because history should teach us lessons so we don't do the same dumb things all over again, which unfortunately we have a tendency to do. It's one of the reasons I'm a fan of Jonathan, because he teaches history, tries to teach his students the lessons of history. And here we are, 12 years, 13 years after Clinton, and we've got a mess on our hands. The thing, however, we've got to understand is that however concerned we are about this deficit, and I'm concerned about it, you can't get out of a recession with austerity. Sorry, folks, Herbert Hoover economics doesn't work. We've tried that once. The EU, for reasons I don't understand, has been trying it lately. How's it doing? Lousy. So at least in the short run, it's not that we don't have to be concerned about fiscal responsibility. We do, always. And by the way, my hat's off to the governor of this state and the people of California who even in the middle of a recession, have done a pretty gutsy thing, and all of a sudden, California is emerging out of this fiscal pit that it's been in for the past God knows how long. And I'm very optimistic about this state, and you should be too. Providing, as the governor said, when he announced the good news, we can't do the same stuff all over again that got us into this mess in the first place. And he's absolutely right. But right now, the priority in this country from an economic standpoint has to be to get us from 7.9% unemployment to 4%, which is effectively full employment. That's got to be the priority, folks. And the best way to cut that deficit and to cut the national debt is to get this economy back on a full employment basis. So at least in the short run, whether one likes this or not, we got to be careful about the cuts, and we got to be doing stuff that will stimulate the economy. What kinds of stuff? Well, in my opinion, the single best way to get this economy moving again, at least if we're expecting our government to do something about it, is to invest in this country's infrastructure, which is in terrible shape. Terrible shape. And I'm not talking about mate work, and I'm not talking about the WPA or any of that kind of stuff. You know, Kitty and I were both born during the Depression. We remember those WPA crews. And, you know, they did pretty good work, but a lot of them were leaning on shovels and that kind of stuff. I'm talking about serious, serious investment in this nation's infrastructure at a time when the rest of the world is going right by us. Going right by us. I spent 16 months of my life up close to the DMZ in Korea, fortunately shortly after the truce back in the middle 50s. I left a country with a per capita annual income of $50. It was a third world country. Serious problems, public health problems, economic problems, poverty problems, all the rest of it. And of course, it had gone through a terrible war. Kitty and I were invited to go back to a student conference, an international student conference in South Korea a year and a half ago. And I said, how would you like to go back to South Korea and see where your husband spent 16 months of his life? She said, yeah, let's go. So we had a wonderful time with these kids in Seoul. And then, thanks to the United States Army and the State Department, we were able to go to the DMZ, to the town of Munsan, where I'd been stationed, 7 miles from the DMZ, to kind of take a look at where I'd spent my life up there. The military team that met us could not positively identify the site of my unit, which was a fairly substantial unit at the time, because South Korea has transformed, folks. It's got the best airport in the world. It built a lot of highways in Seoul, which predictably don't work, but it also built a first-class transit system, which works beautifully. It has not one but 2 high-speed rail lines. This is South Korea. Here's California debating whether or not you ought to have high-speed rail. I don't think the issue is debatable, unless you want to keep using these freeways at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. 2 high-speed rail lines to the southeast and southwest. And we simply couldn't find our way around Munsan because there's this huge commuter rail station right in the middle of what were rice paddies when I was there. That's South Korea. That's South Korea. And those of you who've gone to Europe, gone to Japan, now China, know what it's like to have a first-class, high-speed ground transportation system that carries millions. So for whatever it's worth, I think we've got to put some serious resources into this country's infrastructure, which we have not been doing. And there's nothing like infrastructure investment to stimulate the economy. Now, does that mean we go wild when it comes to other kinds of things? No. Should we be concerned about, and I hate this word, entitlements? Social Security and Medicare are not entitlements, folks. They are social insurance, and the American people have contributed to it and continue to contribute to those 2 very important programs every single day they make a buck. Because 7.45% of that dollar comes out of their paycheck to pay for Social Security and Medicare. So this entitlement thing, this is contributory social insurance. Nevertheless, it's important. But some very modest changes in the Social Security system can deal with that problem. And as for Medicare, folks, that's all about the cost of health care in this country. It's not the Medicare system. It's the fact that we are spending twice per capita, double per capita what the other advanced industrial nations in the world spend on health care. And they insure everybody. And we've got 100 million people who either have no insurance or very poor insurance. So it's not the Medicare system that's the problem. It's this dramatic and unexplained inflation in health costs, which has been plaguing us now for years. Now, what do you do about that? Well, the first thing you do is get the waste out of the system. This is the most wasteful healthcare system in the world. There's more than enough money spent on healthcare in this country to insure every man, woman, child in the United States. What's the problem? Well, one of the problems is a cockamamie health insurance system which takes 25 cents of every premium dollar just for administration. Can you believe this? No other healthcare system in the world spends 25% of the entire cost of the system on administration. Why? Because we got 200 insurance companies with 70 different insurance policies, 50 billing codes, 120 different sets of contract language. It's a nightmare. There are a few doctors in the house. I don't know how many people, I'm not going to ask you how many people you have on staff doing nothing but collecting, but I know it's driving doctors crazy. Here's a factoid for you. The New England Medical Center, for those of you familiar with Boston, is the teaching hospital for the Tufts Medical School, one of our great medical schools. 400 beds, medium-sized, very fine teaching hospital. It's not the Mass General, it's not the Brigham, it's a fine hospital. How many people do you think they have on staff, salaried employees, doing nothing but collecting from insurance companies? What do you think? Would you believe 500 people? Sitting in a large room in cubicles, doing nothing but fighting with the insurance company. This is crazy. I mean, it's making no contribution to the quality of our health care or to the expansion of health insurance for the folks that don't have it. This is just administrative Mickey Mouse, which you guys have to put up with every single day.
Actually, I'm a medical director for a large health insurance. I perpetrated. We'll talk about it.
He's one of the perpetrators, and he's confessing to all of you. So how do you deal with this? Well, look, you can be a single-payer advocate, and there's nothing wrong with that. In my heart of hearts, I think that probably would be a good thing, and it's what Ted Kennedy, Melissa, where are you, first proposed. And if he were here today, Kennedy would say the worst political mistake he made in his career was in not joining Richard Nixon immediately in 1971 to get us a first-class universal health insurance program, which Richard Nixon proposed because Senator Kennedy at the time and his liberal allies and his labor allies didn't want the insurance companies involved. Then, in 1973, Ted had decided, hey, we better sit down with this guy. They started working on a consensus version of the Nixon bill, and then Watergate hit. That was the end of Nixon. That was the end of the Nixon plan, and we lost an opportunity in the early 70s, folks, to have a pretty darn good healthcare system. But there has to be some standardization of this thing. Not 72 policies, 3 policies with the same contract language, with one billing code, and, doctor, with a clearinghouse where you can send your bills to one place and one place only and get paid. What do you think? And it would save billions. I mean billions. So the problem isn't entitlements when it comes to Medicare. It's the fact that we are wasting enormous amounts of money on all of this administrative gimmickry, which is contributing nothing to health care. So I'm for fiscal responsibility. I'm for dealing with the problems of Medicare and Social Security, but I don't think we have to cut benefits. What we got to do is cut the waste out of the system. And if we do that, at the same time that we're investing something significant in this nation's infrastructure, I'm very optimistic that over the course of the next 4 years, we can get back to a full employment economy. I think we're going to get an immigration bill, nothing like an election, right? To persuade people that maybe it's time to do something about that. And I think we can get this country back on track, if you'll pardon the pun, and get cracking. Now, people say to me, well, okay, where are you going to get the money for this infrastructure stuff? In my view, that money has got to come out of the defense budget. And let me just briefly talk a little bit about that, if I can, before we open things up for discussion. I don't know how you feel about this. And I serve in the military. I won't get into gun control except to say that that's another issue, it seems to me, we've got to deal with effectively. The Second Amendment does not give the American people the untrammeled right to run around with a concealed handgun. Sorry, folks, it doesn't. I think the Supreme Court of the United States did us a terrible disservice in even suggesting that, but even they didn't do that. And there's a reason why my state has the lowest gun-related fatality rate in America. It's because we have the toughest gun laws in America. It's not a coincidence. But to national security and the defense budget, and let me just take 5 or 10 minutes and talk about that. Kitty and I are both Depression babies. We were kids during World War II. We remember Korea, we remember Vietnam, we certainly remember Iraq and Afghanistan. And we remember the Cold War, which for our generation really shaped our whole conception of what the world was all about. The Cold War ended in 1990. It ended. Whatever you think of Putin and the Russians and all this kind of stuff, it ended. And we've got a defense budget that is billions bigger than the one we had at the time the Cold War ended, at the time that Ronald Reagan, the big defense guy, was president. And I don't understand it, folks. There's a threat out there, clearly. But it's got nothing to do with supercarriers. At least I don't think Al-Qaeda's worried about supercarriers. Do you? And I don't think we're going to use F-35s on terrorists. I mean, it's a whole different threat. And it certainly needs attention, tough international police work, basically, to get inside these organizations. But what has it got to do with billions and trillions that at least some folks in Washington want to spend on supercarriers and F-35s and all this kind of stuff, which has absolutely nothing to do with the threat that we face? The Cold War is over. Now, there are some people who seem to be unable to get out of this Cold War time warp. They want a Cold War with China. And I don't understand that. What is this paranoia about China? I mean, 90% of what we buy from China. 90% of what we borrow from China. What is this stuff? Well, we're repositioning and pivoting to Asia. We recently sent 2,500 Marines to Australia. To do what? What's that all about? Great for the Marines. It's a great country, great looking women. They love Yanks. I mean, I'd love to be stationed there, but what has it got to do with our national security? I mean, I just don't understand this. I mean, the Chinese didn't invade Iraq. We did. China's a very conservative country these days in many ways. I mean, in terms of its attitude internationally. And in point of fact, doesn't always oppose UN intervention, but is concerned about intervention in a lot of these conflicts. Now, I may not agree with them, you may not agree with them, but essentially this is a pretty conservative country, which will evolve over time, and it's going to take time into something a lot more democratic than it is today. But I don't get this. And it seems to me that this is a great opportunity for the United States not to continue to try to be the world's international policeman, because, folks, we don't do that very well, and in any event, we can't afford it. But a great opportunity for us to use our influence to try to strengthen international peacekeeping organizations, which will make it less likely that we have to be intervening all over the world. Just an example. There must be 6 countries in Asia right now that are fighting over a bunch of worthless islands. I don't understand it, you don't understand it, they don't understand it, to tell you the truth. It's all about national pride and so on and so forth. So, sending Marines to Australia, we're repositioning our carriers. Send them to the World Court. Tell them to resolve their differences there. That's what the International Court of Justice is supposed to do. And by the way, would relieve us of the responsibility of having to run around all over the place. And begin to build a body of international law, if I can use that term, which over time will make it less and less likely that force is used as a means for resolving disputes between and among countries. And I believe that that ought to be one of the principal goals of the United States and the world community. And I think it's achievable. Yeah, we got Iran. And by the way, we helped to create that mess, you know. Right? History, 1953, anybody around? When we overthrew the democratically elected government of Iran? I don't know of anyone who knows anything about Iran that doesn't think that if we had not overthrown Mossadegh. And why did we do that? Because Winston Churchill, an imperialist to the core, did not want Iran to nationalize the oil industry, which was majority owned by the British government. And of course, we followed with the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Guatemala in '54, and the rest, as they say, is history, right? And we've got problems in North Korea. Strange place, strange leadership. Okay, we're just going to have to keep working on that with the international community and with the cooperation of the Chinese folks, because we're not going to resolve the North Korean problem unless the Chinese are deeply and actively involved in that. But even as I'm optimistic about the economic future of the United States, I'm optimistic about the capacity of the world community to shape this kind of future. And Kitty and I may not be there to see it, but the young people that are here and the young people that I'm teaching, I hope are going to be deeply and actively involved in this. As what? As politicians, as public servants, as diplomats, helping to create this kind of world. Now, is that idealistic? Yeah. But then, what's life if you're not idealistic, for heaven's sake? You better not go into politics, kids, unless you're idealistic and an optimist. I mean, if you're a pessimist, don't go into politics. That's not the place for pessimism. If you don't think that good people working together can make a difference in this world, then you're in the wrong business if you want to go into public service. But just to conclude before we have a discussion, I'm very optimistic about this state, about this country, and ultimately about the international community of which we're a part. And as we have gotten out of this Iraq mess, and incidentally, one more factoid. In order to build a first-class national high-speed rail passenger service, we've got to invest about $10 billion a year. Okay? That's the equivalent of 1 month in Iraq. Think about it. Think about it. But I'm very optimistic about the Golden State, about the United States, and about our possibilities internationally as a world leader, but as a world leader that's trying to create a framework within which we can resolve these disputes peacefully. And I think it's entirely possible. But we're going to need all of you, and especially our young people, who are a hell of a lot more interested in public service these days than we were. Thousands of them deeply involved in this last political campaign. Elizabeth Warren had 72 absolutely terrific field coordinators working the precincts for her in that campaign, and without them, she'd have lost. And these kids are hopped up, they're ready to go, they want to run for political office, they want to go out and work for Ed Markey or whoever, you know. I mean, it's really wonderful to see this. So I'm looking forward, even though Kitty and I are getting up there a little bit, I'm looking forward to not only working with these young people and with all of you, but I think we've got the prospects now for a great future ahead of us. Yeah, it's going to be angry, and we're still wasting our time on foolishness like fiscal cliffs and debt limits, which, by the way, were raised 4 times by a Republican Congress during the Bush administration without a peep. Focus on those things we've got to do to make us stronger and better. Focus on the world and our opportunity to do some great things, and get on with it. Thank you.